You're listening to West Coast Water Justice, where we talk about water in the Western United States. I'm your host, Natalie Kilmer. Today we are interviewing Caleen Sisk, Chief of the Winnemem Wintu Tribe.
My name is Caleen Sisk. I'm the Chief of the Winnemem Wintu Tribe from Mount Shasta down the watershed, and I'll also help with the tribe with the village structure and government and religion.
Can you tell us a little bit about the Winnemem Wintu Tribe and help us understand the unique culture and bioregion?
The Winnemem Wintu are from Bulyampuyuk, which is what they renamed Mount Shasta. And on Bulyampuyuk is a sacred spring, the Sawalmem. And in that Sawalmem, Creator had made these spirit beings who used to be around the sacred fire inside the mountain. And he created an outside place and asked all the spirit beings to take physical form so that they could take care of this place that he had built. And as the spirit beings named themselves as they came out the sacred spring and became a physical form on earth, the Winnemem people, or the human, named themselves last. They were the last spirit being in there, not knowing what to call themselves, not knowing what to be. And finally, they named themselves as human, and they go out the door. And as this little spirit being takes form and runs down the path of the stream, Creator looks at that and says, oh, that one's going to need a lot of help. And so he calls back the fire spirit and the water spirit and the mountain and asks them to take care of that little being because he doesn't really know what he's supposed to do. And at that time, the salmon spirit that went out before and took that form comes back and says that he will give them the gift of voice. And so the human got voice so that they could communicate with all other things. And so that's kind of the place of creation, is that watershed, is that mountain that goes all the way down, what they call the McCloud River now, but we call the Winnemem Waywaket, and that goes into the Sacramento River and flows all the way to the San Francisco Bay, to the ocean. And so salmon uses that waterway and connects all the people. And so the Winnemem have been following that belief structure for thousands of years. The Winnemem go back to the spring that every physical form came from. And we go to the door of that spring, knowing that our home is inside of that place. And we sing and let them know that we're still here. We're still doing the best that we can.
Can you tell us how the state of California and the federal government are so heavily dependent on the tribe's local water resources? And just a little bit about that relationship.
Yeah. For some listeners, you have to look at California, and it's one of the later states that joins the Union, 1850. But prior to that, in 1849, the state was primarily inhabited by only tribal people. And so I guess it would be the encountering of other ways of living came later than many tribes in the East. And so if you go back to 1850, they're trying to make treaties with us, but at the same time, the California new government had issued a law that would kill Indians for money, for a bounty. And so many Indians fell to that practice of Sunday picnics and Indian hunts, and they could take those scalps or whatever it was that was said to be of value in that county or that part of the state and cash them in. And some reports at the time said, they could make more money killing Indians than finding gold. So the reduction of the population of California was in short number of years, like from 1850, in that 50 years to 1900, thousands and thousands of Indians died, including up on our river. So that's the kind of the blessing that happened for the Winnemem in some regard is that they didn't kill all the Winnemem, but the first census of the Winnemems was anywhere from 14 to 20,000 Winnemem people on the McCloud River. And by 1910, the census was 395 that had made it. And so when you think about it, it's like my grandma on my mother's side was born in 1880. And my father's side, she was born in 1860. And so they lived through those years that people were hunting them. And so, my grandmas would say, we're here because they were bad shots, not that we weren't shot at. My grandfather, he and his uncle escaped one of the treaty signing meetings where they would call the Indians in and pretend that they were going to sign peace and friendship treaties, would kill all the Indians. And they jumped in the river. That's how they escaped that meeting. But there were so many of those things going on at the same time, the peace meetings to sign these treaties. By 1851, they had made 18 treaties. And our chief, Norel Putis, who later changed his name to Nam Teriman, who signed the treaty for peace and friendship. But as soon as the treaties were all submitted, the California government went against any kind of giving those treaties any recognition because they were afraid Indians were going to get too much land. So the treaties were put into a secrecy until 1905, which, is like 50 years later. They're retrieved, and of course, the government says they're unratified, therefore the Indians have no standing, and there's no real legal taking of our land if they didn't recognize the treaties. So it's a difficult situation in California because there are so many tribal groups in California. One thing about California is we didn't have to go following the deer or elk, or we just made homes on the rivers. And of course, the fish swam up the river 4 times a year. And so you really didn't have to travel in big groups. And so every river that is in California had 2 or 3 different dialects of people, maybe related, but speaking another dialect. So in Wintu, which is Winnemem is part of it, Winnemem would be the McCloud River, and then you have the Nomptipom on the Sacramento River, and you have Norelmuck on the Trinity River, would all have different dialects of language, but similarly related. But when California became that state, the killings went all the way until the 1900s. And then on our river, there was a committee of 100 out of San Francisco land grabbers that wanted to have that area at the same time that the Indian Service was trying to find homes for homeless Indians. So by 1917, they were already talking about the Shasta Dam. And that kind of precluded any real efforts to find Winnemem people a land base in their home area, since it was going to be flooded for the state of California. And you know that the 1930s was the big Great Depression, they called it. Of course, the tribes never really knew anything about a Great Depression. When they started building these water projects in the 1930s, and by 1937, they were already clearing the land and getting ready to finish building the dam and flood the entire area. So by 1941, Congress had put in a bill for Indian land acquisition of the Winnemem's land base. But they never really followed the directions of that act, the 1941 act. all they did was it gave them permission to flood our lands, and that's pretty much all they did was flood our lands.
It sounds like people were living there while the land was being flooded.
Oh yeah, yeah. They actually had to bulldoze houses. I mean, not in the sense that you would think, but lean-tos and the things that people would put together to continue to live on the river. They bulldozed those so that the elder Indians would leave, but they didn't really have any place for them to go. They just had to leave, and they opened up the boarding school system for the younger people on the river. Like my mom and dad were both sent to boarding school in Riverside, which is like 500 miles away from here.
In Southern California, Riverside?
Yeah, Southern California.
Oh, wow.
And of course, you know that it was in the 1940s, and so World War II is breaking out. And so a lot of the teen Indian people in the boarding school signed up for the war to get out of the boarding school, which included, my dad and his cousins and his brothers. They all went into the war to fight World War II. And when they got out, they came back and there was no place to come back to. There was no homes. There was no place that they had moved people to be living in those areas. They didn't really care about the tribal structure itself or the tribe's religion or the tribe's existence.
Wow. Thank you for explaining all that. I haven't heard all that before. That's horrible.
Yep.
So now, basically, most of the homelands are flooded because of Lake Shasta.
Yes.
Yeah. And there's a threat to raise the dam even more.
Right. But see, there's still the people out of San Francisco, like on our river, Westlands Water District owns the beginning of the river to the lake. And then you have PG&E owns a certain part, and they transfer water over to the Pitt River. And Randolph Hearst owns, I don't even know how many acres. And then you have the Fisher brothers. You had the Gap. These are big companies, and now there is a section where the Nature Conservancy owns part of that land too, but the Winnemums own nothing on that land. Yet we have sacred places and particular village sites that we continue to go to. Like my gram said, they might kick us off the river, but they can't kick the river out of us. And so we go gathering, we have sacred places, we dance there, we sing there, we have doctorings, and we gather medicines. And we visit from mountaintop to river for these places that have always been in our tribe. The government now says we're not Indians anymore because they didn't put us on the federal recognition list.
Yeah, well, it sounds like they did negotiate treaties, but then they hid them and strategically didn't use them so that they could seize the land and resources. Is that accurate?
Yep, that's the way it seems. Without any kind of legal taking of the land, it really is that it's on stolen land. Shasta Dam sits on stolen land. That lake is covering up land that they don't really own. They pretend they own it now because it's a Bureau of Reclamation. That's their land. But they can't show where they actually got it from. They just took it. As if no people were there before. It's so messed up because we have village sites there. We have sacred places there that is on the register in the California records. And so we're notified anytime there's a development or something that's going to happen on those sites. And so the sites are recognized, like our dance sites, the sacred sites, the rocks, those kinds of things that are on the register. But we're not recognized. The sites are recognized, and we're the only people that could possibly be involved with that, yet we're not on that list. And so we don't have the same rights as other tribal people. We don't even have the American Indian religious freedoms right to practice or dance or doctor or do anything that involves tribal ways of religion. That's a problem in what California and the federal government ignores with the unrecognized people, because the unrecognized people in California have no rights at all to be Indian, to act Indian, to dance and hold eagle feathers. They don't have those rights. And that happened in 1980 when they did that. And so some tribes have been applying through this process of recognition, filling out the papers, and no one has achieved recognition through that paperwork in California. 5 tribes have been denied that they are tribes, and nobody really knows what that actually means. Are they no longer Indians? Do they no longer even get to oversee their sacred sites? Or, what does that mean when you don't make the list of tribal people? It's a form of genocide by ignoring the basics of the struggle. It's like the Winnemem people, as well as many other tribes, never knew what poverty was until we were pulled off of the way of life that we knew and tossed into this other way that is really sheer poverty. And we didn't have the rights. That Indian people didn't have citizenship until 1924. I mean, the McCloud River used to run like 1,000 CSFs in the summer, 6,000 in the winter. PG&E put a dam up there, in which we're saying Winnemums were never consulted on that dam being placed on our river. And they ship water 11 miles over to be held in Iron Canyon Reservoir and then dumped down into the Pit River to generate power. But what happens is that water is taken. McCloud River water runs anywhere from, 50, 56 degrees, maybe a little bit more or less than that. But normally it's 56 degrees, which is pretty cold and which is viable for salmon, for the Chinook. But when they ship water over to Iron Canyon, they have reduced the McCloud River from running at 1,000 CSS to 6,000 in the winter, down to 200 CSFs.
So is the tribe recognized as a rancheria by the state, or no recognition at all? Is that what you're saying?
No recognition at all. And that happened in the 1980s. See, prior to that, the California Indians brought a lawsuit against the federal government and the state of California for lands taken, the California claims case. It took 50 years from 1928, once they were citizens and could bring a suit against this government as citizens. They filed that lawsuit in 1928, and there was 3 government rolls taken, one in 1928, one in 1950, and then one in 1970. The suit was ended in 1970. The state then was considered on or near a reservation for all Indian services, from the Indian Service, which turned into the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so from 1970 to 1980, the Indians of California received all benefits and services, meaning you could get a scholarship to go to college, you could go to vocational education programs, you could get a house, you could get a well dug, you had all of those benefits of from preschool on up. You could be in the educational. And then the bills that were passed in 1970s under Richard Nixon, like the Indian Self-Determination Act, the Indian Education Act, the Indian Child Welfare Act, and the American Indian Religious Freedoms Act all benefited all California Indians because of that lawsuit, right? The California claims case. So every Indian that was in that claims case, which included me, so we all have roll numbers that identify us as Indians of that claim case, were the beneficiaries of all of those things. But by 1980, somehow they changed the rules, and the executive branch of the government overruled the judicial branch of the government and made us unrecognized, with the opportunity to apply to become recognized, to regain those exact same services that took the tribes 50 years to gain. They took away, and now they said you could apply for them. So they successfully reduced the number of California Indians from 300,000 California Indians to the BIA list of 28,000 that were federally recognized. And then, of course, of the 28,000 that were federally recognized, they themselves disenrolled another 11,000. So the budget for California fell from, 300,000 Indians eligible for services to 28,000, and then less than that by tribal entities' own choices. But they took, the really sad part about that is that in the claims case, when the California Indians won that claims case, they won $29 million. And at the time, it was kind of like a lot of money. But from that $29 million, the attorneys were paid, but also everything that was given to any of the rancherias, like horses, seeds, blankets, clothing, food, if they could come up with the documentation that they paid for it, it was deducted also from the lawsuit. But the worst thing about it is that they deducted what California paid individuals for killing Indians, was paid out of that money. So we actually paid for the people to kill us, to kill our ancestors, our elders. And then we also paid for every rancheria in California. That is now the basis for those Indians to be recognized. And those lands were at that time considered communities of homeless Indians. They were not tribes. But in 1980, they turned them into tribes and totally disregarded the tribes of the area. So it's a mess. It's a total mess in California about, a lot of the tribes that are carrying on traditions and ways of life are not recognized. Only the rancheria in their area is recognized. Like for Wintu, not just the Winnemem, but all the Wintu in Shasta County, Siskiyou County, Trinity County, that's the areas that we expand in. Only the Redding Rancheria is is recognized, and they're not all Wintu. They're Pit River, Wintu, Yana, and they're not all they don't practice any kind of way of life. They have skills, they have some things, but it is a problem that exists in California that has messed up the whole system.
Yeah, that sounds really messed up. With all these challenges and basically genocide by the U.S. government, I'm just wondering, the state of affairs on land and water rights and policy today for the Winnemem Wintu.
That's the problem that we have, is that, my grams, Florence Jones, was the first Indian doctor to utilize the Native American Indian Religious Freedoms Act in 1978. By 1980, she's no longer a recognized Indian, just like that. There's no proof that we didn't exist anymore, that we didn't have our ceremonies anymore, or anything like that. It was just a stroke of a pen and somebody's idea to make a list. So now we don't have the same rights, but as we told the Forest Service just recently and the Bureau of Reclamation, is that you have an obligation to this tribe, the Winnemem Wintu Tribe. We have engaged with you from day one, and we continue to do that. And now you're pointing at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, because we're not on that list, that you think you don't have to deal with us anymore. That is not right. Those are still our sacred sites. Those are still our villages. Those are still the salmon that we want to come back on this river. And you need to deal with us. There's no other tribe that can step in, and they won't, because we're still visible. We're still doing this. And so it is a messed up process. And it doesn't even make sense, because some of the other Wintu groups, like the Wintus of Northern California and the Norelmuck, have applied for recognition. The Wintu tribe applied in 1992 and have not achieved recognition yet. And the same with Norelmucks. They've been in the system applying as well as many other tribes in the state of California. That process isn't intended to make more tribes. And there is a lot of misunderstanding about California, in that they have 112 tribes now, just in California, of the 565 tribes nationwide, with another, at least 65 tribes applying in California, because the tribes are smaller and there are more waterways, and it's a vast piece of land. California is a big state. So that's one of the issues. But in the 1980s, they talked about raising Shasta Dam, right? Now they're creating this list in the 1980s. They leave off the Winnemem Wintu, who have been active with every federal government agency on that lake and river, from, the Forest Service to the Fish and Game to the Bureau of Reclamation, continually fighting for our rights and protecting sacred sites and access to our river. They don't put us on the list. We have an act of Congress about that lake and dam, and the first U.S. fishery was on our river, and we were there. Yet they couldn't find the reason to put us on that list. And the only reason that we can think of is because they don't want a federally recognized Indian tribe on the mouth of the McCloud River going into Lake Shasta, which they're trying to raise. Since the 1980s, they wanted to raise it. And so, we would never get recognition. Dianne Feinstein, we got all the way to the Senate asking for federal recognition by the Senate. And she voted against it. She didn't make it happen. And she's still there. And so, we have to outlive people that don't care about Winnemem Wintu or the tribal rights or our future generations. And she's one of those people.
Yeah, well, if you all own the water rights to Shasta Dam, it would make you the richest tribe in California, I would think.
Right?
Yeah.
And I think that's what they're hiding. It's like they don't want Indian tribes. It's like they're afraid, like Westland's Water District, they're afraid that if we were the water right holders, that we would cut them off. And it's like, well, they don't put too much faith in us. I mean, they're still thinking that we're savages.
So are any of those businesses, like the Westlands or the Hearst Corporation or the Fisher Brothers Gap, are any of them engaged in the land back movement for the tribe?
Not so much. I mean, they have a what they call, there's a California resource code on the river to protect it like a wild and scenic river. That's part of the issues with the Bureau of Reclamation flooding the river, because it is under state protection for a wild and scenic river.
The
The
McCloud.
McCloud River.
Okay,
Yeah.
got it.
But they have, because it is that, it's a state recognized river, which means there's a co-management team of people or organizations or landowners that are to uphold the protection of the river. And at the time, the Forest Service wanted to submit the river for wild and scenic on the federal level, which then means it would be more of a public access ability of the river, right? So the state code actually allows the landowners to keep it private. So the public can't just really go onto the river and be there and, have access.
Oh, I didn't know that. So if it's a federal wild and scenic, the public can access it.
Yes.
But if it's a state wild and scenic, you can't access it necessarily.
You can access the river, but you can't get out on the banks.
Oh.
So like whitewater rafters have to have special permission unless they come out on Forest Service land, which is public land. But any of the rest of the river, which is mostly private, they cannot get off on the banks. They couldn't pull out and stay overnight and make the rest of the trip.
So you've been telling us about your resistance story against the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation and the federal government and the state government and some of the stakeholders. Maybe you could just clue us in about the 18-foot dam raise and what's at stake, and then also how the site's reservoir could also affect. Would maybe then the dam not need to be raised 18 feet? I'm just trying to understand all these moving pieces.
They've been talking about raising Shasta Dam since the 1980s. However, in the 1940s, when the dam was being built, it was supposed to have been built 200 feet higher than it is. It's at 602 feet now, but it was proposed to be 800 feet. And because of funding and I don't know whatever else was out there, they capped it at the 600-foot level. And so some people feel like, well, it's already been approved for 200 foot higher. And now they're only talking about 18 and a half feet. But in reality, the amount of water that could be held, even with the 18 and a half foot raise, would not make a dent in the California water problems. And if you look at the California water systems, it is probably the most complex, complicated system in the world. And part of that stems from the 1914 Water Rights Acts that put in senior and junior water right holders and what they can do and all of that. But one has to remember that in 1914, women didn't have a right to vote. Even the white women didn't have a right. They couldn't own things. And they didn't get that right until 1922. So the water right of 1914 was very selective. The tribal people didn't get citizenship till 1924, even after the women got their rights. And so no tribes were really in the water right deals that were going down. So nowadays, everything goes back to the 1914 water rights. But what we're saying is that we need to update the 1914 water rights so that it's more inclusive of indigenous communities, of tribal communities and reservations, and women. That's the big push now, is to try to get more equal treatment and usage of water. And that's going to be a big deal because, the water mongers are the wealthiest people in California. They're not going to want to entertain changing the 1914 water rights that they have. But if you go to a water meeting, you will see that nearly the room will be filled with elderly white guys with white hair. You won't see very many women. You won't see very many people of color or women of color. And you won't see very many people who are under the age of 45. And so that group is the group that's pushing and generating the water issues. And so they have proposed this during Brown's administration, a water fix. The water fix plan was to put 2 tunnels in the delta for shipping more water, build Shasta Reservoir to store water and basically the runoff surface water in the wintertime to be stored at sites, and to raise Shasta 18.5 feet to capture more water to fill sites. And if you look at the plan, it's like it pretty much cannot exist. It's like a toilet. You have to have the tank, you have to have the bowl, and you have to have the pipe that goes out. If you don't have one of those things, it doesn't work. And like Shasta Dam is the tank, the Shasta Reservoir is the bowl, and the pipes that go out of the delta finishes up that toilet. And so now we have been opposed to the Shasta Dam raise, and we have been engaged with the CEQA process and the AB 52 studies on the lake and on our sacred sites, and how much flooding will happen upriver where we access our places now. And they're still pushing the Delta plan under Newsom, and it's been reduced to 1 pipe, but it's a huge pipe. It's a big pipe. And we are in the Delta as well, because we're asking that the TCR, which is the traditional cultural resources, which are our salmon, have to be protected when they come in from the ocean, or they'll never reach upriver. And so we're pushing that, as well as I think a few other tribes are also engaged in opposing the Delta plan. Why build a bigger tunnel if you're only going to get the water that you have right now?
Thanks so much for all your time and information, Chief Caleen. I really appreciate it. And folks, please check out links in the description to learn more about the tribe. You've been listening to West Coast Water Justice, produced by me, Natalie Kilmer. Subscribe and listen wherever you get your podcasts. The music is from the album Now That's What I Call Surf by Tony Bald, Adam Anigias, and Danny Snyder.